G'day painters! Today I'm breaking out the Stormcast Eternals paint set from Games Workshop and seeing what I can do with it. Let's get to it. There are a few things I'm using from this that aren't from the paint set, so let's go over them first. The first two things you'll have laying around your house: a cup for water to clean your brushes and a napkin or paper towel for drying them. Next is an extra brush that didn't come with the set. This is purely because I'm lazy and didn't want to do the base coat with a smaller brush that comes with the set. You definitely can use that brush, it'll just take a bit longer. I couldn't bring myself to do it when I have a big old beat up brush that I could use instead. For building the models, I use my clippers, hobby knife and plastic glue. You'll definitely need at least the hobby knife and glue. I think it's well worth getting some clippers too, but you can skip them if you're looking to save some money. Then as a palette I'm using a tile. I'm not using my wet palette here because I feel like that's more of an investment that you wouldn't be getting when you're first starting out. You could use the plastic from the paint set as a palette, or anything else you might have laying around the house. I like the tile because it's smooth, easy to clean, and they're only like 10 cents at your local hardware store. But it's not something you have to get. You'll definitely have something else you can use laying around the house, so use that if you need. And the final thing, and what I think is the most important thing, is a primer. You can paint straight onto the model without priming it first, but you're doing yourself a disservice. If you're looking to get into this hobby, don't leave the hobby store without a primer when you first buy your paints. It'll save you a lot of frustration and make the initial learning curve just way smoother. With all that out of the way, let's get this box open and see what we're working with. The first thing is a sprue that builds 3 Stormcast. I'll be building and painting one of these guys and putting the other 2 aside for a planned video in the future. Then we have the brush. I ended up having a love-hate relationship with this brush by the end, but I'll go into more detail about that later. Then it's the paints. We have 6 pots here, but one of these is a technical paint for the base and one is a shade. So we effectively have 4 colours, which is really gonna limit what we can do here. 2 of the 4 paints being metallics makes things even harder, but in the end I get a decent result with just these paints. But first, the model needs to be built. I'm not going to show too much of this, but did want to give one tip. With push fit models like these, if you're not careful you often end up with gaps where they're meant to be joining. My experience, and the most common advice online, is that if you clip off a bit of the small nub parts that are meant to go into the holes when you push them together, that eliminates the gaps. And then you don't have to worry about filling any gaps. Much easier. And then once it's built, hit it with some primer. Finally, it's time to paint. This is where I used my big old beat up brush. You can easily do this with the smaller starter brush that comes with the set, but if you have a bigger brush you can use, save yourself a bit of time and use the bigger brush. I covered the whole model with Retributor armour. You could avoid the parts that are going to be other colours if you want, but it's quicker and easier to just paint the whole model and save the detail work for later. Next, with Cantor Blue, I start blocking in the parts I wanted to be blue. This was the front of the shield and the shoulder pads. Since there's no brown, I decided to do the grips of the hammer and sword as well as the leather straps as blue too. The choice here was to do them either blue or white, since leaving them gold wouldn't look right, and silver won't work either. In the end I settled on blue, but you could go with white for the straps if you'd like. I did have to give this 2 layers to get a nice even finish. It's always worth thinning your paint and doing more layers to get a smooth finish. Speaking of white, that was next. Corax white isn't a true white, it's much more of a grey than a white, but that's fine, it's the colour we have and we'll make it work. With the white, I do the lightning bolts on the shield and the shoulder pad. I also did the other shoulder pad with this, but I changed my mind on it later and ended up going back to gold. Doing this part, I swear it nearly broke me. I'm way too spoiled in the brushes that I have to work with. This isn't a bad brush. In fact, I got into this hobby almost 30 years ago, and a brush like this would have been amazing at that time. But the brushes I use these days are so much better, and it was just really hard for me to go back to a lower quality brush, and I just really struggled with it. On top of that, we're hitting summer here and having some pretty hot days. Without my wet palette, I was really struggling to keep the paint at a consistency I was happy with. The combination of these things ended up making me take a few day break after this painting session. I'm far too spoilt these days with the tools I get to use. Enough complaining. Next was Leadbelcher for the silver parts. This is his scale mail and his hammer. I thought about doing some other parts Leadbelcher to break up the gold a bit, but I couldn't settle on what. And in my opinion, there aren't really any parts that would break it up well and still look good. Plus, Stormcast is supposed to be majority gold, so I left it as it is. Then, with Retributor armor, I finished the design on the front of the shield and the one on the shoulder pad that I decided to change. If you're enjoying this video and want to see anything else I paint, why not hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with my videos. Whether you're a brand new painter, fresh to the hobby, or an experienced painter that's been in the hobby for years, surely my videos have something for you. So hit that subscribe button, keep up to date, and while you're there, hit the like button too. This is the other time I used my bigger brush. With Agrax Earthshade, I gave the entire model a pretty heavy wash. I'm being careful to avoid pooling, but I want it to be a heavy wash. We don't really have anything we can use for highlighting, so I need to rely on good shadows for the definition. We're effectively establishing our shadows and mid-tone here, then I'll come back in with the other paints later to do some highlights. Make sure you let this dry properly before moving on to the next step. I'd give it 30 or 40 minutes depending how heavily you did the wash. Time for the highlighting. I started with the Corax wire and pick out the raised parts that would be getting hit by the light. Thankfully this was a cooler day, so I was having a much easier time keeping a nice consistency of my paint, which made a big difference, and I wasn't getting frustrated with the brush anymore. Then I did the same with Cantor Blue, picking out the top of the shoulder pads and the edges, as well as the top parts of the shield. Then I mixed a bit of Corax white into the Cantor Blue and did some edge highlights just on the shoulder pads. I don't think this came out very well, and I don't think it's worth doing. If I was painting the other two, I wouldn't do this step on them, so I'd probably suggest you skip it too. Then with Leadbelcher we're doing the same thing. The hammer was easy, just picking out the parts facing upwards and the edges. For the scale mail, I just highlighted towards the ends, the parts that are poking out a bit where the light would pick out the edges. Then the final highlight is Retributor armor. Work around the model picking out any parts that are facing upwards and would be hit by the light. Something to consider is that you want to highlight larger sections higher up on the model, making the highlights smaller as you move down the model. More of the lower portions would be shadowed and getting less light, especially things like the foot that is like bent under the body or anything like that. Next it's time for the technical paint on the base. If I was thinking, I would have grabbed some blue tack and put the base on top of one of the paint pots to make it easier to handle. But I'm stupid, so you can learn from my mistakes. Though I did do it later. I went pretty light with the Astro Granite here. I actually think you should go a bit heavier to get some nicer texture on it. But it's really up to you how heavy you'd like to go, and how much texture you're looking for. After I'd done the Astro Granite, I put the Stormcast on the base while it was still wet, so his feet would sink in and it would look like he's stepping on it rather than floating over it. After giving the technical paint about an hour to dry, I broke out Agrax Earthshade and gave the entire base a heavy wash. This gave a nice brownish finish instead of the grey, making it look more like a muddy base, which I think fits the texture well. You could use the Astro Granite and the Agrax Earthshade combination to make jungle bases with some stuff from your yard, or a friend's yard, but we don't talk about that. If you're interested, I do have a jungle bases video on my channel you can check out. The final step is the base rim. Obviously I don't have black, so I had to settle for one of the other colours, and I chose the blue. Since I messed up, and caught it on camera, and this is a video for newer painters, I figure it's a good time to talk about how you can fix a mistake if you're quick. After hitting the shield with the blue by accident, I quickly clean my brush in the water, dry some of the water out of it, then use my brush to wipe off the blue. Then I use the napkin to soak up any leftover water and any of the blue. It's very simple to tidy up mistakes like that. You just have to be quick and make sure you get to the mistake before the paint starts to dry. And it's done. Considering the lack of paints to use and the brush I was using, I think he came out okay. Obviously he's not up to my normal standard, but when you're working with limited tools, there's only so much you can do. Except for the texture on the base rim. I'm not sure how I screwed that up, but clearly I did, and that's pretty disappointing. If you're fresh to the hobby and you're starting from this set, assuming you've bought the hobby knife, glue and primer already, I think the next purchase depends on your location. If you're somewhere you have to deal with heat and low humidity like I do, I think a wet palette should be a very early purchase for you. If I wasn't having so much trouble keeping my paints a nice consistency, I wouldn't have gotten as frustrated as I did with the brush. But on the other hand, if you're in a nicer climate and don't have to worry about your paint drying out on your palette in 30 seconds, some better brushes should be your next purchase. I think any of the brush sets from the major suppliers would be good. Vallejo, Army Painter and Games Workshop all do 3 brush sets that would be a good place to start and give you some nice brushes for more detail work, or bigger brushes for base coating. Thanks for watching. I've picked up a couple of other paint sets to try out, and I'll be giving them a shot over the next few months between painting my other models. So if you'd like to see my opinion on other paint sets, or just want to see what else I'm working on, why not hit that subscribe button? And of course, if you've enjoyed the video, give it a like. Thanks for watching, catch you in the next video.